I'm a practice director at Donald Insall Associates, and we've just actually been doing a little bit of work for you in your City Road at the Wesleyan Mission there. And so I really appreciate you actually asking us to talk here. We specialise in listed buildings, so buildings that are known as buildings of special historic and architectural interest. They can be quite old. We can work from anything from 1540 to about 1970, but sort of that's what we do, anything that's historic. So I'm going to talk to you really about the particular issues of historic buildings in your Methodist property portfolio. I also want to talk about some of the issues and also hopefully give you some inspiration. So just before I move on, let's very briefly about us. 120 of us in London, Chester. We've got just opened a Birmingham office, also Oxford, can't remember, Bath and Cambridge. We're employee owned, and we were started by Sir Donald 60 years ago, actually last year. And so Sir Donald he still comes into the office twice a week. Now, Methodist property, you've got, it's 900, it seems to be slightly different figures, but seems to be 628 or maybe slightly more listed buildings, and historic England that you've got rather more than perhaps you thought you had, so I'm not quite sure why those figures are different. You've also got 1,000 buildings actually in conservation areas. And one of the things, I was brought up in the Church of England, so I didn't actually know that much about the history of Methodism. So I've actually sort of been boning up a little bit on. And so most of your listed chapels, and some of them date from the 18th century, a lot from the 19th century, following the Wesleyan Methodist General Chapel Fund of 1818, which I didn't know about before. And then you've got the Dissenters' Chapels Act of 1844. So, but because Methodism was really pioneering in actually putting schoolrooms and other rooms as part of the actual next to a chapel before the C of E did it, you have some of these buildings are actually listed as well. So I just actually can't see terribly well because of the sun at the moment. So yeah, slightly what I'm doing. I actually can't read at all here, so I'll try and look at the screen. So with regard to listed buildings, I'm just going to quickly go through this and then give you some sort of ideas. We've got three different types. Grade 1, they are exceptional interest, Grade 2 star, and Grade 2. And I'll just show you some Grade 1 buildings. These are all obviously Methodist chapels, and why they're Grade 1, why they're exceptional, is because they have great architectural quality. It's not about size, but it's also about their historic interest and actually their influence. So if someone's been, if it's built by a well-known architect or it's been very influential, they will be Grade 1. And I'll talk a little bit about more the restrictions of how you can change those in the next bit. Now, then you get Grade 2 star. This building is one of them. Again, they are of, you have to consult with Historic England, like Grade 1s. But you can do a little bit more with them, but they're still very, very important. And what I showed here is just actually also remind you, and it was actually stimulated by the talk by the Bishop earlier, that Methodist property isn't just about buildings. You've also got sites. And one of those extraordinary things, I know Mao Cop quite well, and I remember being quite inspired by the story of primitive Methodism. I thought, well, actually, you know, some of these sites, you could actually use them because they're quite attractive to young people who used to go into music festivals. Because I was thinking, gosh, you know, those early days at Mao Cop, it must have been amazing with 3,000 or 4,000 people up there singing and praising. And perhaps, you know, you could do more of those. It's not really my field. Again, but Grade 2 star. Again, this is in Stoke-on-Trent. I know it quite well. An amazing chapel. And Methodism, obviously, chapels were built in the rapidly expanding industrial areas of Britain. No, they were built quite quickly. This is actually when Stoke-on-Trent was becoming quite rich from the ceramic making, and it's a very, very fine chapel, but unused, I'm afraid, at the moment. These are Grade 2 buildings. They're still of special interest. These actually aren't ones on the Methodist, it's both Methodist churches. You can do more with them, but what happens quite often, we find that certainly with lots of our clients, that people say, it's Grade 2, we don't need to, it's only the inside that's protected, or it's only the outside that's protected. It's still all protected. And this is actually a building in Chester that we were working on as architects. We reordered it. Now these are buildings called non-designated heritage assets, which again conclude chapels. The interiors aren't protected, but you can't demolish them. And these just are buildings in conservation areas where you can do a lot more with them, but you can't really change the outsides as much. And the Wesleyan Chapel that we're looking at in City Road, it's a listed Grade 2 style listed building in a conservation area. So it limits maybe things that you can do to the exterior. Now, this is the key thing, is what does this mean regarding reuse? And you've got two acts. If you have a working chapel, you'll have ecclesiastical exemption, but you'll still have to actually follow the letter of the law. And the first one is this 1990 Act, and it's special regard to preserving the building or setting, and that's quite important to follow up. And then also the character and appearance of a conservation area. And what's quite tricky about interpreting these acts is that people, again, tend to think, it's just about the features of a building, it's about the decorative features. No, it's not. It is about the roof, it's about the plan form as well. And so what we do in our team is we spend a lot of time, it needn't necessarily be a church, it could be any type of historic building, researching them and actually finding out their history, what's happened to them over time, and what's sort of special about that building or place. And then you can help actually do the interventions that you need or actually repurpose the building. But you do really need to understand what it was for and actually make that case, make that argument. Right, now here, I just want to give some examples now of things where things have changed. Now, last night, I went to the rededication of this church, which we've been working on with Dewa King Architects. And it's in central London. It was by Wren. It got bombed in the Second World War and rebuilt. And we've been working on the reordering it. A really beautiful church. It was a 2-hour-long ceremony. Incense, very high church, holy water. It was the whole thing. But what's so interesting about it is that, and I don't really know of other sort of very high churches like this, that it's actually quite flexible. They also they use it, or because it's quite central London, they also use it for fashion shows. It's quite a flexible space, but it's still being maintained as a church. And actually, the pews, I actually don't have an image of the pews inside, but they still have pews. The pews can be moved. This is another one that actually we've been working on recently. This is no longer a church, but it's actually we've been looking at how to make it into an indoor market. But again, it's something that you think, well, actually, it could be both. And again, this one is a former church that was bombed, and it's actually now, again, it's been completely reused, deconsecrated. It was a ruin for a long time, but it's now been reused as a centre for the London Symphony Orchestra. Now, this is one of my favourite buildings. It's actually a medieval church in Hereford, which is not far from where I grew up. And the extraordinary thing, it's about 10 years ago, they introduced, it's right in the centre of Hereford, and it was very, very little used. But they introduced a cafe into it, and it was quite innovative architecture at the time. And what's great about the cafe, it's in one of the side aisles, and it's got a balcony, but they've kept the chancel intervened with, as it were. So when you go in to have lunch there, quite often if you're in the centre of Hereford, you go in, you have your bowl of soup, whatever, and you use the loos, but they're actually on the way, you see the little notices about the church's mission and what they're doing, and you think, okay, this is interesting. And you can actually you don't have to shut the church and just have a cafe. You can have them both working together. And actually I have been to a little service there, and because they've left the chancel as it is, it feels fine with appropriate lighting. You can have a small service there and it doesn't feel like you're sitting in a cafe. And it was the first time that I ever really saw a church that I thought was actually successfully used for two different purposes. This is actually another building I know quite well. We call it colloquially the Round Chapel in Hackney. And again, it's still used as a chapel, I understand, but it's actually become a music centre and Hackney music services. And I've been there maybe 20, 30 times for concerts for my children. And again, a fantastic space. It's a huge chapel, very difficult to fill it constantly, but it's still going. And it still works. But what they've done, and again, I think this is what the bishop mentioned earlier, they've invested in good sound systems. They've invested in actually some glamour, because people want to go to they're glamorous buildings, chapels and churches in many ways. And actually, things need to attract people in them. They actually need to look nice, need to look beautiful. And this one really, really, really does work. Now this is actually more modest, and I found this, I don't know this building, but when we were doing our research, and it was the chapel, a former chapel that was where the Tolpuddle martyrs used to worship. And I thought it was a bit sad actually that the Methodist Church had sold it. It's now being, eventually after many years, it's now being, the group of volunteers being made into a museum, and I thought, well, actually, I didn't know the link between Methodism and the Tolpuddle martyrs, but now I do. I think, oh, that's really exciting. I've really thought, oh, Wesley was really interesting, and actually what he was doing at the time, he was talking to ordinary people about religion, and I suddenly thought, oh, lots of the things that I've taken for granted in the C of E, actually congregational singing, all of those sorts of things were part of the Methodist tradition. And I thought, well, if I'm becoming quite interested because I'm learning about this history, maybe there's a way of actually drawing other people in through those sort of routes. Now these are just some other, just completely different things that we've been involved with. And the grade 2 buildings with a chapel. The top one, I think I should have made a slightly bigger image. I hope you can see it from the back. Is actually Biggin Hill Chapel in Biggin Hill Airport. And it was a chapel that was built after the Second World War as a memorial to the pilots who had fallen in the Second World War. And they were really struggling with using it. Not enough people were actually using the chapel at all. So they decided to actually make a museum adjacent to the chapel, but keep the chapel as part of the museum, but also for use. And it just opened, I think just last year. We were working with Robin Lee Architects on this. Something quite contemporary, bringing a new building right next to it, but again keeping the chapel in use, but really giving it a new life. The other buildings I'm just showing here, where the chapel use has completely gone. And that seems to be, again, sometimes you actually need to, but you can actually do something useful. We've got one here of a theatre, and this one, perhaps the least effective solution is a private house. This one, again, is one of my favourite building types are the sort of tin tabernacles. which actually are becoming increasingly rare now, because these were all put up in areas where industry grew very fast, as well as quite often sent overseas for mission. Because they're sort of built of corrugated iron and timber, they didn't necessarily last very long. But actually now a lot of them are being listed, which is wonderful. But they still can be reused. You can still actually insulate them. They're still wonderful. Now, this, in a way, you can't get as far from a Methodist chapel as a pub. But I wanted to put this one in because I thought it was very exciting. It's in Newcastle-under-Lyme, which is not so far from the Bethesda Chapel, which in Stoke-on-Trent, which I showed you earlier. And it was a derelict pub that sat there derelict for probably about 20 years. And over the last 2 years, it's just been converted into a memory cafe for the new dementia housing centre that you can see to the right. And I thought, again, that really in the previous talks actually, was can you use chapels as partly a cafe, as partly as a centre for a new housing scheme? Because their chapels are outward facing buildings. And the great thing about this memory cafe here is that actually when you go to see someone in a dementia home, it's actually, especially if you've got children with you, it's quite scary. But actually having a cafe where you've got lots of people there and actually lots of members of the public, it's not so frightening for the children, and so you don't get this issue of people being parked away. And I thought actually chapels are brilliant to actually use that, because I remember when my grandmother had dementia, she was shoved off to her home, and we were never allowed to see her as children. Whereas I think that is something that old buildings actually are very useful at housing, because you have the memories. It's not just about talking about memories of people, but it's actually structures. And particularly in one of those few things that people have are memories of their environment, and actually using those buildings to actually, so that they can actually talk to younger people about, this is what it was like in my day. It starts these conversations going. And it's not a job that was one of ours, but it's something that I found really inspiring. I've sort of been talking to our practice about it and saying, don't you think we should be actually working with listed buildings and new development as part of dementia care? My mother has dementia, so it's something that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. And now we're looking at unlisted chapels. Again, looking at, there's all sorts of ways that you can reuse them. Again, these are buildings that have been sold off and are no longer chapels. But again, perhaps there is a way that you can actually do things to perhaps keep the mission involved in some ways. And I think this one, I was again quite inspiring. This was a Methodist chapel that was sold off, and the Landmark Trust have recently made it into a holiday cottage. And I thought, well, actually, there's a shortage of holiday cottages. It's quite difficult. If you've ever tried to book a Landmark Trust holiday cottage in the summer, it's very difficult. I think, well, perhaps if you hadn't sold that off, is it all these little Methodist chapels in sort of remote areas, could you actually have a property portfolio for holiday cottages, which has in the corner, has a little book, which talks about the history of Methodism. And so you actually engage people that way, so you actually don't lose the property, but you're still maintaining it and gaining income from it. It's just really thoughts that actually have been stimulated by this morning. And really, that's the last slide. But it's been quite an interesting thing for me coming here, because we tend to focus on the, not necessarily bricks, but the stones and mortar. But actually, our motto of our company is living buildings. And from you, I've been hearing about the life going on in the buildings. I think there is a dialogue that is actually quite exciting about reuse that I really want to take forward with you. Thank you very much indeed.